She said she would never forget the way her grandmother held her hand that night, not weakly, but with the desperate strength of someone trying to prevent something terrible from happening. The whole room smelled of old medicine and wilted flowers, but there was something else there, a strange, metallic smell that seemed to come from the walls, as if the house were breathing slower than it should. Her grandmother, already too weak to even keep her eyes open, gasped for air and whispered those 3 words she would never fully understand: "Don't let it in." There was no explanation, no warning, no time to ask what it meant. Grandma just closed her eyes, as if seeing something behind her, something approaching, something that shouldn't be in that room. And when the monitor beeped for the last time, the feeling that remained wasn't one of loss. It was that her grandmother had left before it could enter. A silent presence that seemed to have stayed in the corner, watching, waiting for the next door to open. In the following days, the phrase echoed in her mind like a constant knock. Don't let them in. But let what in? Her grandmother's house, where she was forced to sleep to organize things after the wake, was strangely cold, even with all the windows closed. The lights flickered, not as if there was a power outage, but as if something were passing in front of them, blocking the light. And there was the hallway. That hallway that was too narrow, too silent, that ended at her grandmother's bedroom door. Every time she passed through there, she felt a shiver run down her spine, an almost childlike sensation that someone was walking behind her, only without footsteps, without sound, just presence. On the 3rd night, when she finally tried to sleep, she heard the first sign, 3 knocks on the door, slow, measured, as if the house were following a ritual. She got up, her heart in her throat, and asked who it was. The silence answered. But then, in the thinnest whisper she had ever heard in her life, came the phrase that froze her blood, "May I come in?" And in that instant, she understood that her grandmother wasn't talking about people. She was talking about what lives between doors and shadows. She said that on that first night after the whisper asking to come in, her body simply refused to move. It was as if every muscle understood something that her mind couldn't yet explain. Opening the door would mean much more than allowing someone in. It would mean inviting their presence, acknowledging it, accepting it, and everything inside her seemed to scream silently not to do it. She stood before the closed door, feeling the rhythm of her own breath rise and fall, as if she were running, even without moving. The house seemed to wait with her. There was no wind, no cars passing outside, no sound other than the flickering lamp trying to stay lit. And then it came again, not the whisper, but something lighter, more irritating, more intimate, the scratch, as if small, old, fragile nails were sliding down the door from top to bottom, very slowly, almost as if imitating the touch of a human hand, but completely failing to seem alive. She took 2 steps back, stumbling on the rug, unable to take her eyes off the door that now vibrated slightly, as if something on the other side was tired of asking permission. Grandma always said that certain things only enter when invited. And that night, she realized that the phrase had never been a metaphor. She lay down on the living room sofa without taking her eyes off the dark hallway, trying to convince herself that everything was the result of tiredness, grief, emotional exhaustion. But when she closed her eyes for a second, she heard breathing. Not hers, not someone upstairs's. It was a deep, slow breath that seemed to come from the walls, as if the very structure of the house had lungs. She held her breath, waiting. The breathing continued. Deeper, closer, warmer. Dawn broke, and she realized that the darkness in the house was not normal. Moonlight streamed in through the window, but was absorbed by the hallway, as if the shadow were thicker than the air, drinking in any glimmer that dared to enter. The feeling was that that part of the house was alive, watching, waiting for her answer, and that's when he heard her name, not in a whisper, not from outside. The name came from above, from the ceiling, as if someone were lying directly on top of her, calling with a hoarse, drawn-out, broken, but recognizable voice. It was Grandma's voice, Grandma's perfect voice, the voice that no longer existed. She froze. The whole house seemed to hold its breath along with her. "Grandma?" Silence. "Grandma? Is that you?" The silence was broken by a dry sound, as if something very heavy had crawled through the ceiling. The wood cracked, the ceiling dropped a millimeter, the house groaned, and the voice answered, "Open up, before it's too late." It wasn't a request. It was an order that carried something hidden beneath, something that didn't belong to Grandma, but that tried to use her sound, as if it were wearing her voice like clothing. She felt her stomach churn. Grandma never said, "Open up." She would never speak like that. And Grandma, above all, would never ask for something that would put someone in danger. For a moment, she thought of running out of the house, but the front door, without any wind, without human touch, locked itself. The click echoed through the room like a sentence. She tried to turn on all the lights, but some went out instantly, as if something were passing from bulb to bulb, testing for flaws. The kitchen was completely dark. The hallway, too. The only point of light was the living room where she was, and even that seemed to diminish little by little, weakening like a candle at its end. She curled up on the sofa, hugging her legs, and swore she felt something touch the floor behind her. A soft, yet present weight, as if someone had just descended from the ceiling to the living room rug. The sound came soon after. Footsteps, not human. Footsteps that had no rhythm, no cadence. Steps that dragged, as if the joints were bent at the wrong angle. Footsteps that approached, but didn't raise dust, didn't make an impact, didn't belong to real feet. Her heart was beating so hard it felt like it was pounding in her mouth. And then, 3 meters from her, the breathing intensified, now closer, warmer, more real. She heard the air going in and out very slowly, as if the presence was sniffing the room, searching for something specific. And then the voice returned, now clearer, more molded, more false. "Aren't you going to open it for me?" She knew. He knew that her grandmother had left that warning for a reason. He knew that the thing there didn't want to enter through the door. It wanted to enter her mind, the house, everything. And that, for that, it only needed her to say a single word. The bedroom door slammed shut. The hallway darkened completely, and the shadow that wasn't hers lined up at the foot of the sofa, waiting. She said that that night, while the shadow stood at the foot of the sofa, waiting like a patient animal, something inside her began to tremble. Not with fear, but with recognition. It was as if the presence was pulling up old memories, memories she never lived, but which now surfaced as quick flashes in her mind. Her young grandmother, holding the bedroom door with both hands. A child crying in the hallway, a whisper coming from behind the walls, always repeating the same plea. "Let it in." She swallowed hard, feeling a metallic taste rise in her throat, and realized the air around her had changed. It was no longer cold, still heavy air. It was warm, pulsating, as if breathing with hunger. The shadow took a step, not towards her but towards the window, as if circling the room, testing vulnerabilities. The glass fogged from the inside, leaving a strange shape, imprinted, like a face trying to emerge from the surface. The whole house seemed to contract with the movement, creaking from floor to ceiling, as if tired of holding it captive. Because, at that moment she realized, the house wasn't possessed, it was imprisoned, and the thing that wanted to enter didn't come from outside, but from within, trapped between walls, trapped in old wood, trapped somewhere that Grandma had spent her life trying to keep closed. She stood slowly, feeling something, following her movements, as if the shadow were synchronizing every inch of her body, lingering slightly, observing, studying. The dark hallway pulsed as if it were alive. The door to her grandmother's room was now ajar, slightly tilted, as if pushed open by fingers too long to be human. The dim light in the room flickered so much it seemed about to go out, and each time it blinked, the shadow seemed to shift position, sometimes closer to the kitchen, sometimes closer to the stairs, sometimes behind her, as if rehearsing the best way to reach what it wanted. She tried to speak, but her voice came out hoarse, scratchy, as if something were holding her vocal cords. The shadow immediately stopped, tilting its body at an impossible angle, alert. It was as if the entity recognized any sound she emitted as a kind of permission, and before she could control her fear, the voice scraped behind her, now deeper, older, heavier. "You promised." She turned so quickly that her vision blurred for a second, but there was no one there. Nothing, just the narrow hallway, pulsing like a throat about to swallow. The shadow moved again, this time mimicking her grandmother's walk, the dragging of her feet, her shallow breathing, the light touch on the wall, only crooked, flawed, as if it were reconstructing a body that didn't quite remember how to exist. And then came the worst. The shadow began to speak in her grandmother's exact voice. "You know what happens when you open it." The phrase hit her like a stone, making her stomach clench. Her grandmother had never explained, never told her where the fear came from, never spoken openly about it. She only said that certain doors weren't meant to be opened, certain presences weren't meant to enter, certain names couldn't be answered. She tried to recoil, but the floor seemed to slide beneath her feet, as if the house were directing her steps, leading, guiding, pushing toward her grandmother's bedroom door. The room was completely dark, but alive. The wood breathed. The walls trembled. The old mirror on the wall had a dark stain in the center, a stain that pulsed as if it had a heart hidden behind the glass. She entered, or rather, was pulled in before she even realized it. The air in the room smelled exactly as it had minutes before Grandma died. Flowers, medicine, metal, fear. The shadow entered behind her silently, filling the space as if it were the true owner of that part of the house. And, when the door closed by itself, Grandma's voice spoke, not as a warning, but as an order. "Now you will listen." She felt the floor slowly sink, as if the wood were yielding to an invisible weight. The mirror vibrated. The shadow rose beside her, forming an outline of something human, and completely wrong. And then the figure in the mirror, her own reflection, smiled first. Not a natural smile, a thin, slow, drawn-out smile, as if the face were being pulled by invisible threads. She froze. The reflection raised its hand. She didn't. And that's when she understood. What was in the mirror wasn't her. It was something waiting to take its place. The voice behind her whispered, "Let it in, and everything will go back to where it should be." The floor creaked, the shadow split into 3 parts, and the mirror began to crack from the inside out. She said that when the mirror began to crack from the inside out, there was no sound of breaking glass, no crack, no explosion, nothing you expect when something rigid gives way. What there was a wet, deep sound, as if the surface of the mirror were flesh being ripped open from the inside. Each crack spread like dark veins, pulsing, breathing, forming tortuous paths to the edge. And the worst part wasn't the mirror opening. It was her reflection, smiling with a calmness she had never known in her life. A smile that didn't tremble, that wasn't afraid. A smile that seemed to know it was about to step out of that glass and occupy the space it had always wanted. She tried to take a step back, but the floor seemed glued to her feet, as if the house wouldn't allow her to retreat. The shadows thickened, circling her waist, her shoulders, climbing the wall like black snakes that crawled silently. The light grew so dim that everything looked like a charcoal drawing, dark, blurred, alive. And then the reflection spoke. It didn't move its lips. The voice simply came from the cracked glass, as if it were the first place where the entity had learned to speak clearly. "You know why she said not to let it in?" A chill ran down her spine like an electric shock. Her grandmother had never explained why she feared that voice, that presence, that thing that seemed to live in the seams between the walls. She always just said, "Don't answer, don't open, don't let it in." But the reflection continued, now mimicking her grandmother's exact voice. "She knew you were the last door." The words came like slaps. Last door, last barrier, last person capable of stopping it from breaking free. The shadow behind her breathed harder, and the warm sensation on her neck made her heart skip a beat. It was a breath that didn't belong to anything living. Too damp, too close. She closed her eyes, not out of courage but out of despair, and felt invisible fingers touch her shoulder, light as dust, heavy as death. When she opened her eyes, the reflection was no longer smiling. It was watching, quiet, patient, as if waiting for her reaction. The central crack widened, exposing a darkness so profound it seemed to pull air in, like a giant lung. The reflection raised its head with ritualistic slowness, and the voice that came this time was neither hers nor her grandmother's. It was something in between, a strangely harmonious and completely wrong mixture. "I was with her first. Now I am yours." The floor vibrated beneath her feet. The walls groaned as if part of the house was trying to resist, while another part encouraged the entity's entry. And that's when the memory surfaced as quick as a flash, as strong as a punch. Her, a child, standing before the attic door, her grandmother yelling for her to get out of there, the voice behind the door repeating her name for the first time. She didn't remember that day. The memory had been buried so deep that it seemed impossible to access it. But now the entity was returning it, piece by piece, forcing her to remember, forcing her to relive. The reflection placed its hand on the crack, as if touching a liquid surface, and the shadow on the floor mimicked the movement. The fingers passed through the glass without resistance, as if the boundary between the worlds had been erased. The figure inside the mirror began to emerge. First the arm, too long, then the narrow shoulder, then half the face that tried to be human but failed in symmetry. The house made a deep sound, a profound rumble, as if it were fully awakening. And then Grandma's voice, the real one, not the imitated one, echoed like a scream in her mind. "Don't answer!" The reflection stopped mid-exit, as if the word had struck its core. The crack pulsed. The shadow behind it trembled. Something began to creak on the ceiling, as if fingernails were scratching the wooden paneling. She pressed her hand against her chest, feeling her breath escape in sobs. The mirror gleamed with a faint, sickly light, and the entity spoke again. "She locked me in. You will release me." Shadows rose around her like roots, wanting to climb up her legs. The whole house seemed to hold its breath, awaiting the choice she would make. The voice inside the mirror whispered with poisonous sweetness, "Say my name." But she didn't know the name. She never had. And then the entity answered as if it had heard her thoughts. "You know, it's here." And it touched the center of her chest through the glass, as if pulling the memory out. The room grew so cold that the air turned to mist. The reflection leaning out of the mirror watched her like someone watching a lost object finally found. The shadow in the background slid closer. The ceiling creaked. The floor dropped an inch. The whole world seemed to expect her to say something, a word, a syllable, Anything that would open the door her grandmother had spent her life trying to keep closed. She closed her eyes. She felt the voice rise in her throat as if it weren't hers. And then the 3 words her grandmother had said on her deathbed echoed, not as a warning, but as a final command. Don't let them in. But something answered from inside the house, from inside the mirror, from inside her. Too late. She said that when she heard that phrase, too late, something inside her broke, as if a thin, ancient thread, stretched since childhood, had finally snapped. The air in the room changed texture, becoming denser, stickier, almost liquid, as if she were breathing inside a living body. The shadow that had previously spread to the corners began to climb the walls, forming contours that moved independently, as if they were arms searching for something to hold on to. The mirror, now fully open, pulsed in a rhythm that seemed like a heartbeat, and the creature emerging from it seemed increasingly solid, increasingly human, and, at the same time, increasingly wrong. It was as if it were using her reflection as a mold, as if trying to fit itself into the exact shape of her face, her body, her soul, but failing by millimeters, creating a nauseating feeling of near identity. She recoiled, but recoiling was useless. The house blocked all paths. The door behind her slammed shut, pushing a cold wind that made her hair stand on end. The ceiling began to creak so loudly it seemed about to collapse. And then, in the suffocating dimness, she saw something that chilled her blood completely. Old photos falling from the shelf. Photos of her grandmother when she was young. Photos of her family. Photos of her as a child. All with the same detail. A black blur in the corner. Always near her. Always present. Always drawing closer year after year, like a silent visitor being captured by accident. The entity wasn't new. The entity had been there since before she was born. Grandma held the door open long enough for her to have a childhood. The reflection emerged almost entirely from the mirror, its long fingers scratching the floor. It made no sound, no footsteps. The only sound was the house itself breathing, as if its lungs were full of dust and secrets. The entity stood up, crooked, bent, dragging its body as if testing each movement. The eyes weren't eyes, they were deep holes shining from within, as if reflecting something behind it, something waiting for its moment to be seen. The voice that came now didn't imitate anyone. It was the true voice. The voice Grandma feared. The voice that lives in the space between one word and another. You are the last door. She tried to answer, but her throat closed up. The entity tilted its head, observing like a predator studying its prey. Your grandmother almost succeeded. She locked me in, she kept me away, but she weakened, and you were born open. The phrase pierced her like needles. Born open. The entity moved closer. I've been calling you since the day you learned to speak. You just didn't remember. She recoiled until her spine pressed against the wardrobe. She felt the wood vibrate against her back, as if the entire piece of furniture were about to expel something. The shadows on the ceiling began to drip, like thick liquid, falling to the floor and transforming into small fragments of darkness that crawled towards the mirror. The entire house seemed to move towards the entity, as if drawn to it, as if fulfilling an order too ancient to be questioned. The creature placed its hand on her chest and didn't touch skin. It touched what was beneath. An icy heat, impossible, contradictory, invaded her body, and her vision darkened at the edges. She felt her legs give way, but the entity held her with monstrous delicacy, like someone holding a fragile object they had waited too long to touch. I just need you to say it. She understood. It wasn't force, it wasn't body, it wasn't physical invasion. The entity needed verbal permission, a word, a yes, a name, anything that would open the final rift. Grandma had prevented it for decades. Now it was up to her. And the creature knew exactly how to break it, because the voice changed. It became soft, warm, familiar. It was Grandma's voice. "Daughter, let me in. It's me." She fell to her knees. The emotional shock almost made her say yes. The memory of her grandmother holding her hand, telling old stories, soothing her nights of fear. It all came rushing back like a cruel tide. But the phrase that echoed before Grandma died, that phrase that seemed more like destiny than a warning, pulsed like a scream deep in her mind. "Don't let her in." The entity sensed her hesitation. It brought its face, or what was its face, closer to hers. "She already knew I would come for you, but she didn't have the strength to tell you everything. I can show you. I can give you back what she took." The ground vibrated as if something were striking beneath. The mirror glowed with black light. Shadows rose like arms waiting to embrace her. The entity slowly opened its mouth, revealing not teeth, but an infinite darkness, as if each word that came out of it came from a place where no human would return alive. "Say my name." She felt the word rise from her throat, not because she knew it, but because the entity wanted her to know it, forcing, injecting, shoving artificial memory into her mind. The name was there, formed, ready to come out. And then she saw something in the mirror, behind the entity, behind the shadow, behind the darkness, the reflection of her grandmother, not the weak grandmother, not the dying grandmother, but the grandmother from before, firm, serious, with the same look she used when protecting her family from invisible things. Grandma raised her finger, not at her but at the entity, and shook her head in denial. A small gesture, but powerful. The entity looked back, too quickly, breaking its neck with a grotesque snap. And in that moment of distraction, she found the strength to say, not the entity's name, but her grandmother's words, "I won't let it in." The house screamed, the mirror exploded, the entity contorted itself into an impossible shape, as if being pulled by dozens of invisible hooks. The shadows receded as if burning. Wood split open, the ceiling fell in bursts of dust, and the floor cracked in two long lines, expelling the creature back into the darkness that had spawned it. The final scream didn't come from her mouth, it came from the walls, a scream so deep it seemed to tear the soul from the house. And then silence, absolute silence. The house stopped breathing, the air grew light, the shadows disappeared. She fell to the floor, trembling. The room was destroyed, the mirror reduced to shards, the door wide open. And Grandma wasn't there, no reflection, no voice, only the certainty that she had held the door that had previously been held by another woman. Days later, when she finally decided to leave, something happened in the hallway. A light breeze, impossible inside the closed house, touched her shoulder, and a voice, soft, true, familiar, whispered, "It's closed now." She smiled, crying. But when she looked at the floor, she saw two sets of footprints leading out of the room, hers, and a second set, lighter, shorter, stopping in front of the front door. The door was ajar. Someone was outside, or something. And the voice, not her grandmother's, called her name again. If you listen to this until the end, comment, "I won't let them in." And don't forget to like and subscribe, because some doors only stay closed when we remain vigilant.